The moment the guns fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a continent unrecognizable, scarred by destruction that reached far beyond shattered buildings and ruined roads. Cities that once thrummed with life now lay in ashes, factories were gutted, bridges had collapsed into rivers, and entire villages had vanished from the map. Millions of people wandered in search of shelter, food, or even a scrap of normalcy, their lives uprooted by years of relentless conflict. The war had not merely redrawn borders on a map, it had torn open the social, political, and psychological fabric of the continent, leaving survivors to face a future filled with uncertainty and fear. As the victorious Allied forces, Americans, Soviets, British, and later the French traveled through liberated territories, they encountered scenes that defied imagination: children scavenging among ruins, towns emptied of men and women, and the horrifying remnants of concentration camps, silent witnesses to the extremes of human cruelty. In this landscape of devastation, the question that haunted every leader, diplomat, and military commander was not only how to rebuild what had been destroyed but how to prevent history from repeating itself. From the very beginning, the Allies understood that victory alone could not guarantee peace. The memories of the First World War were still fresh, a stark reminder that punitive measures alone could fuel resentment and lay the groundwork for future conflicts. In Tehran in 1943, and later at Yalta and Potsdam, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin gathered not to celebrate triumph but to deliberate on the difficult task of creating a new order. Each came with their own vision and strategic interests. The Soviet Union sought security and a buffer zone of friendly governments to protect against future invasions. Britain aimed to maintain influence while stabilizing a war-weary Europe. The United States, emerging as a global power, envisioned a democratic and cooperative international framework to prevent another catastrophic war. These competing priorities shaped every negotiation, every argument, every map sketched on conference tables littered with papers, coffee cups, and ashtrays, where the fate of millions would be decided far from the ruined streets below. Germany, the epicenter of Europe's destruction, became the focal point of post-war settlements. The Allies agreed that it had to be disarmed, demilitarized, and divided to ensure that it could never again threaten the continent. The country was split into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, with Berlin similarly partitioned despite lying deep within the Soviet sector. This arrangement, temporary in theory, laid the foundation for the eventual division into West and East Germany, a political reality that would endure for decades. But the reorganization of Germany was not simply about punishment, it was also about reconstruction, denazification, and preparing a nation for a future that had to balance accountability with the prevention of further resentment. Factories were rebuilt, transportation networks repaired, and systems of governance cautiously reinstated, even as Allied authorities struggled to manage the vast humanitarian crisis of displaced persons, starving civilians, and refugees navigating the devastated landscape. Germany's restructuring was only the beginning. Across Central and Eastern Europe, borders were redrawn with profound consequences. Poland, long caught between Germany and the Soviet Union, lost its eastern territories to the USSR and was compensated with former German lands in the west. Millions of Germans were expelled from areas that had been home for generations, forced to trek across devastated roads in winter, carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. Similar upheavals occurred throughout the continent. The Baltic states were absorbed into the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia regained independence but ceded Ruthenia to the Soviets, Romania and Hungary relinquished disputed territories, Italy lost colonies and ceded northeastern lands to Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia itself emerged under communist leadership with expanded borders. These changes, dictated by the victors, transformed not just maps but the lives of millions who had to adapt, flee, or accept new authorities overnight. The human cost of these adjustments was staggering. Forced migrations became one of the largest in European history. Entire communities were uprooted, families separated, and cultural landscapes transformed. While planners justified these movements as necessary for long-term stability and security, they left a trail of trauma and resentment. Refugees walked for miles across bombed-out roads, and makeshift camps proliferated, filled with those who had lost everything. Meanwhile, survivors struggled to rebuild not just homes and infrastructure, but trust, governance, and social cohesion in societies fractured by years of occupation, collaboration, and resistance. Amid the chaos, the need for political stability became paramount. Nazi and fascist regimes were dismantled, leading to trials such as the Nuremberg trials, which sought to bring war criminals to justice and establish accountability in international law. Across Western Europe, democratic governments were promoted and rebuilt, sometimes under heavy Allied supervision, while in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union installed governments aligned with communist ideology, creating a geopolitical divide that would become the defining feature of the Cold War. The continent was effectively split into two spheres, a capitalist West supported by the United States and a communist East controlled by Moscow. These ideological divisions were not merely abstract, they dictated economic systems, governance, social policies, and even the lives of individuals living near newly imposed borders. Yet in this landscape of destruction and division, there was also a glimmer of hope. International institutions, most notably the United Nations, were founded to foster cooperation and prevent future conflicts. Economic recovery programs, such as the Marshall Plan, sought to rebuild not just infrastructure but confidence and stability. The war had demonstrated that no country could exist in isolation, and European nations gradually began to recognize the need for cooperation, even as political tensions simmered beneath the surface. Slowly, the bones of a new Europe began to emerge, one rebuilt on alliances, trade, and shared interests, yet shadowed by suspicion, displacement, and the unresolved legacies of the past. The post-war settlements of Europe were, in essence, a monumental exercise in managing human and political consequences on an unprecedented scale. Cities, populations, borders, and political systems were reconstructed almost simultaneously, in a delicate balance between justice, pragmatism, and strategic necessity. The decisions made during this period would not only shape Europe for decades but would also provide lessons about the power of diplomacy, the dangers of unchecked aggression, and the resilience of societies emerging from catastrophe. Europe in 1945 was a continent in ruins, yet in that destruction lay the fragile seeds of reconstruction, the foundation for a new order, and the cautionary tale of what happens when nations allow war, ideology, and ambition to spiral beyond control. Rebuilding a fractured Europe. As the echoes of artillery faded, Europe faced the daunting task of not just physical reconstruction but political, economic, and social rebirth. Cities lay in ruins, yet beneath the rubble, the intricate machinery of governance and diplomacy began to stir, orchestrating a continent-wide revival that had to balance justice, survival, and forward-looking pragmatism. Roads were impassable, railways destroyed, and ports unusable, leaving entire nations isolated and struggling to feed millions. Factories that once powered economies lay silent, and agricultural lands were littered with unexploded ordnance, scorched earth, and famine. Across Europe, people looked to the skies and the distant Allied capitals for relief, unsure if help would arrive in time to prevent another wave of disaster. The challenge was unprecedented: how to rebuild nations whose very foundations had been shattered, while simultaneously redefining political authority and security across the continent. The urgency of reconstruction sparked a flurry of diplomatic activity. Western Europe, especially, faced the dual pressures of immediate humanitarian needs and long-term stabilization. France and Italy, exhausted from occupation and collaboration crises, struggled to assert governance over territories whose citizens distrusted authority. Britain, though victorious, was financially drained and internally fractured, relying heavily on American aid to maintain influence. The United States, emerging as a superpower, recognized that Europe's recovery could not rely solely on war reparations or traditional diplomacy. It required comprehensive economic support and strategic investment. This realization led to the conception of what would become the Marshall Plan, a bold infusion of capital and resources aimed not just at rebuilding infrastructure but also at creating resilience against political extremism. Economists, engineers, and political advisors coordinated across borders, often traveling between cities still under rubble, measuring not just miles of road or tons of coal but the morale of populations teetering on despair. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union approached reconstruction through a very different lens. Having suffered the greatest human and material losses in the war, Stalin viewed rebuilding as inseparable from security and ideological expansion. Territories captured by the Red Army were quickly integrated into the Soviet sphere, often accompanied by forced political alignment, collectivization initiatives, and the establishment of local communist leadership. Infrastructure repair was tied directly to economic and political control, ensuring that as cities rose from ruins, so too did Moscow's influence. Eastern Europe, in this sense, became both a laboratory for Soviet administrative methods and a buffer zone against perceived Western aggression. While Western Europe rebuilt through cooperation and open markets, Eastern Europe reconstructed under surveillance, top-down planning, and ideological conformity, creating two fundamentally different approaches to recovery on either side of the emerging Iron Curtain. Germany's own reconstruction became a case study in the complex interplay between occupation, governance, and diplomacy. The Allied zones had to function semi-autonomously while preparing for eventual reunification, even though tensions among occupiers were already growing. Western zones received heavy logistical and financial support from the United States, emphasizing industrial recovery, education, and democratic governance. Factories that had produced war machinery were converted into civilian production facilities, and administrators meticulously audited records to remove Nazi influence from every level of civil service. In the Soviet zone, priority was given to extracting reparations, dismantling factories for shipment to the USSR, and imposing socialist economic structures. Ordinary Germans, meanwhile, faced food shortages, housing crises, and social upheaval, yet many embraced the slow return of order, motivated by survival as well as a tentative hope for stability. Beyond economic recovery, Europe grappled with the immense human consequences of the war. Millions of refugees, displaced persons, and prisoners of war required resettlement. Families that had been uprooted by border changes, ethnic cleansing, and forced migrations struggled to reclaim homes or rebuild communities. Camps were established to manage these populations, yet conditions were often harsh, reflecting both the logistical difficulty of moving millions and the lingering distrust between ethnic and national groups. Education, public health, and labor systems had to be rebuilt almost from scratch, with governments and international organizations working together to prevent famine, disease, and social unrest. Every policy decision had to balance efficiency with fairness, knowing that missteps could ignite political or social backlash. Simultaneously, the Allies recognized that lasting peace required not just reconstruction but a framework for international cooperation. The United Nations was founded in 1945, aiming to prevent future conflicts through dialogue, collective security, and legal mechanisms. its creation was a direct response to the failure of the League of Nations, combining lessons learned from World War I with the urgent realities of post-World War II geopolitics. While the UN offered hope, its effectiveness depended on the willingness of powerful states to cooperate, an uncertain prospect given the growing ideological rift between East and West. Europe's recovery, therefore, had to proceed even as the undercurrents of the Cold War began to take shape, threading a careful path between collaboration and confrontation. Cultural restoration became another significant dimension of Europe's revival. Museums, theaters, and universities, many of which had been damaged or occupied, were gradually restored, providing a sense of continuity and identity to traumatized populations. Literature, journalism, and art documented the horrors of war while also serving as tools for reconciliation, memory, and education. Intellectuals and civic leaders promoted the rebuilding of civil society alongside physical infrastructure, recognizing that lasting peace required not only roads and factories but also the institutions, norms, and shared values that sustain social cohesion. In cities like Warsaw, Dresden, and Rotterdam, reconstruction efforts were both practical and symbolic, a declaration that life, knowledge, and culture would endure despite devastation. At the same time, borders themselves continued to solidify across the continent. Poland's shift westward, the absorption of the Baltic states into the USSR, and the realignment of Italian and Yugoslav territories exemplified a Europe whose political geography had been dramatically reshaped. These decisions, often executed with military oversight, population transfers, and bureaucratic efficiency, reflected not only the desire to punish aggressors but also to create defensible, manageable, and ideologically aligned states. Each new border, while offering strategic advantages to certain powers, carried profound consequences for those who lived near them, creating long-lasting tensions and demographic transformations that would resonate for decades. Despite the immense challenges, Europe's post-war recovery demonstrated remarkable resilience. Coal production resumed, rail networks were rebuilt, and cities slowly repopulated. Political systems evolved, balancing between democratic aspiration and authoritarian control, depending on regional context. Social networks, though strained, found new forms of expression, from neighborhood committees to transnational aid organizations. Citizens adapted to new economic realities, often taking the initiative in rebuilding homes, businesses, and farms while navigating the complexities imposed by occupation authorities and shifting governments. In this dynamic and precarious environment, Europe began to regain not only functionality but also hope, a tentative sense that the continent could rise from its ruins while learning from the mistakes that had plunged it into catastrophe. By the end of the decade, Europe had undergone a transformation that was both visible and invisible. Railways and roads connected towns once isolated by war, factories and farms supplied food and employment, and political systems though divided began to establish long-term stability. Yet beneath the surface, ideological tensions simmered, and the scars of population displacement, border changes, and wartime trauma remained. The continent had been physically rebuilt, but the social, cultural, and psychological reconstruction would take generations. Still, the post-war settlement, fragile and contested though it was, had established a foundation upon which modern Europe could eventually emerge, a continent profoundly altered, yet resilient enough to confront the challenges of a new global order. The shaping of new powers and emerging divides. As Europe began to recover from the immediate chaos of war, a subtler struggle emerged, one that would determine the continent's political landscape for decades. While cities were rebuilt and borders enforced, the question of authority, ideology, and influence dominated every decision. The continent was no longer a monolith of independent nations, it had become a chessboard where old powers tried to reassert themselves, emerging superpowers tested their reach, and local populations sought to navigate lives caught between ambition and survival. The vacuum left by a defeated Germany created opportunities, but also risks, as nations and peoples confronted the delicate task of self-determination under the shadow of foreign oversight. In the West, the United States moved decisively to stabilize Europe, recognizing that economic collapse could breed political extremism similar to that which had fueled Nazism and fascism. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1947, infused billions of dollars into Western European economies, rebuilding industries, infrastructure, and transportation networks. Factories that had once produced war machinery were repurposed for civilian production, and ports, roads, and railways were reconstructed to facilitate trade. This financial aid was not only practical but also strategic. It reinforced democratic governance and fostered alignment with Western ideals, positioning Europe as both a partner and a buffer against communist expansion. Cities like Paris, Milan, and Rotterdam became centers of innovation and commerce, symbols of revival, demonstrating the potential of coordinated international effort. For citizens who had endured years of occupation, bombings, and scarcity, the aid represented hope, not just survival, but the possibility of a life rebuilt. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union consolidated control over Eastern Europe, establishing governments aligned with Moscow's ideology and installing political structures that prioritized centralized authority over individual freedoms. Nations such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania underwent rapid political transformation, with communist parties gaining dominance through elections often influenced or monitored by Soviet authorities. Economic policies emphasized state ownership and collectivization, which clashed with centuries-old traditions of private enterprise and land ownership. Citizens faced new restrictions on movement, expression, and political engagement, yet the Soviet narrative framed these measures as necessary to secure peace and prevent future invasions. For Moscow, the borders and the governments it shaped were as much about ideology as they were about security. The buffer zone created by loyal satellite states served to protect the USSR from potential threats, ensuring a strategic advantage in a continent recovering from catastrophe. Germany's division crystallized this emerging East-West divide. In the Western zones, democratic institutions, free press, and market economies gradually took root, producing the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. Industrial recovery, coupled with American support, transformed cities like Frankfurt, Stuttgart, and Dusseldorf into engines of economic growth. In contrast, the Eastern Zone, under Soviet control, became the German Democratic Republic, where political life revolved around a single party, centralized planning and surveillance. Berlin, divided between East and West, became a microcosm of the ideological and physical separation that increasingly defined Europe. Citizens' lives were daily negotiations of ideology, economy, and opportunity, as crossing from one sector to another required not just papers but acceptance of competing political realities. This division, though initially administrative, hardened into a symbol of the emerging Cold War, a tangible manifestation of the fissures shaping post-war Europe. Elsewhere, the reconfiguration of borders and populations continued to generate friction and tension. Millions who had been displaced by war, occupation, or forced migration sought to resettle in territories that now belonged to new governments. Germans expelled from eastern regions faced arduous journeys westward. Poles relocated from areas annexed by the USSR attempted to integrate into formerly German lands. Italians in regions ceded to Yugoslavia struggled to maintain cultural identity amid new authorities. These movements, often involuntary and traumatic, left deep social scars. Communities were redefined, local economies disrupted, and identities challenged, creating layers of historical grievance that would influence regional politics for decades. Even as cities and industries rose from the ruins, the human stories of loss, adaptation, and survival reminded Europe's leaders that maps alone could not heal the wounds of war. The establishment of international institutions reflected the recognition that cooperative frameworks were essential to sustaining peace. The United Nations, created in 1945, provided a forum for dialogue and conflict resolution, while organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank facilitated economic stability and investment. In Western Europe, the beginnings of what would eventually become the European Union took shape, as nations sought to link economies, reduce friction, and prevent the conditions that had led to previous conflicts. These initiatives were both pragmatic and visionary, illustrating an awareness that political stability required economic interdependence, cross-border cooperation, and collective security measures. In Eastern Europe, parallel institutions operated under Soviet oversight, emphasizing centralized planning and ideological alignment, further reinforcing the division between two competing models of governance. Cultural reconstruction ran parallel to political and economic recovery. Artists, writers, and intellectuals across the continent began documenting the war's devastation while imagining new futures. Museums, theaters, and universities, many damaged or repurposed during the conflict, were gradually restored, serving as hubs for education, innovation, and civic life. Literature, journalism, and art did more than entertain, they preserved memory, offered critique, and promoted reconciliation. In cities such as Warsaw and Dresden, cultural revival became an act of defiance against destruction, a statement that human creativity and resilience could survive even when the physical world had been annihilated. Civic leaders and educators worked to reintegrate youth who had experienced war firsthand, aiming to build societies capable of withstanding future crises without succumbing to extremism. Security concerns, however, remained paramount. The war had demonstrated that ideological aggression could not be ignored, and the emerging divide between East and West prompted the creation of defensive and military alliances. NATO formed in 1949, representing Western Europe and North America's commitment to collective defense. In response, the Warsaw Pact would later formalize Eastern Europe's military alignment under Soviet leadership. These structures institutionalized the divisions already visible in Germany, Poland, and other regions, embedding strategic considerations into the daily life of nations. Citizens, governments, and armies learned that reconstruction was inseparable from vigilance. Political, economic, and military strategies became intertwined in ways unprecedented in European history. Ultimately, the post-war reshaping of power was about more than territory, it was about influence, ideology, and the capacity to shape the future. The United States and Western Europe cultivated systems of open markets, democratic governance, and international cooperation, while the Soviet Union consolidated centralized control and a sphere of influence stretching from the Baltics to the Balkans. Germany's division exemplified the broader continental split, and the consequences of population transfers, political restructuring, and ideological enforcement created both immediate stability and long-term tension. By the end of the 1940s, Europe was no longer simply a map of nations, it was a complex ecosystem of alliances, economies, and societies in which power, fear, and opportunity intersected in ways that would define the global order for decades to come. Europe, scarred but striving, had begun the delicate balancing act of recovery. Roads, ports, and factories returned to operation, yet the invisible currents of ideology, influence, and human displacement shaped every aspect of life. Citizens rebuilt their homes and communities while navigating new governments, languages, and social norms. Borders enforced by treaties and armies were mirrored by invisible lines separating economies, political thought, and cultural identity. The continent's revival was therefore both tangible and intangible, measured not only in steel, stone, and wheat but also in trust, collaboration, and resilience. As Europe looked to the future, it understood that reconstruction was not simply about restoring what had been lost, but about constructing a foundation for a world that, it was hoped, would never again descend into the devastation of global conflict. Toward a fragile peace and the dawn of the Cold War. By the early 1950s, Europe had emerged from the immediate rubble of war into a landscape of cautious recovery. Cities once reduced to skeletal remains now hummed with life once again, markets reopened, trains ran on repaired tracks, factories resumed production, and schools welcomed children who had been forced into displacement or survival work during the conflict. Yet beneath the surface of rebuilding, the continent was deeply fractured. Political, economic, and ideological divisions were now firmly entrenched, and the question was no longer just about survival or infrastructure, but about the long-term stability of Europe and the preservation of peace in a world freshly scarred by total war. Nations began to understand that the battles of 1939 to 1945 had not ended with the surrender of Germany and Japan. They had merely shifted into subtler, more complex arenas of diplomacy, influence, and global tension. The first signs of these new tensions appeared in Germany, where the stark contrast between the Federal Republic in the West and the German Democratic Republic in the East created both opportunity and conflict. In the West, democracy and market economics, fueled by American investment and guidance, facilitated rapid industrial growth and social development. The German economy, once synonymous with militarization, now became a symbol of recovery and resilience. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Frankfurt displayed modernized infrastructure and renewed civic vitality. Meanwhile, in the East, the Soviet approach emphasized centralized planning, collectivization, and strict political control. Surveillance, suppression of dissent, and state-directed economic priorities ensured ideological conformity, but at the cost of personal freedom and public trust. Berlin, divided into sectors, remained the physical and symbolic fault line between these two competing visions, representing the broader ideological division emerging across the continent. Elsewhere, Eastern Europe solidified its alignment with the Soviet Union. Nations such as Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria established communist governments, often under close supervision from Moscow. Elections were conducted under strict oversight, dissent was curtailed, and economic policies focused on collectivization and state ownership. The Soviet model extended its influence into political institutions, cultural expression, and social organization, creating societies that were heavily regulated but politically secure. In contrast, Western Europe pursued a model of integration, democratic governance, and economic cooperation, with France, Italy, and the Benelux countries forming early alliances that would eventually evolve into the European Economic Community. These contrasting approaches established the contours of the Cold War, a period defined by ideological competition, strategic maneuvering, and a pervasive undercurrent of mistrust that would shape international relations for decades. One of the most profound outcomes of the post-war period was the mass movement of populations. Refugees, displaced persons, and ethnic minorities navigated shifting borders that had been drawn with little regard for centuries of community, culture, or tradition. Germans expelled from eastern territories migrated westward, Poles relocated from the Soviet-annexed East settled in former German lands, Italians who had lived under Yugoslav jurisdiction faced relocation or forced assimilation. These migrations, often abrupt and traumatic, reshaped the demographics of entire regions. Families were separated, communities dissolved, and centuries-old cultural identities were challenged. Yet despite this upheaval, survivors adapted to new realities, rebuilt local economies, and slowly integrated into the evolving political frameworks. Human resilience became as significant a factor in Europe's recovery as financial aid or infrastructural investment. Economic revival in Western Europe was further bolstered by international initiatives such as the Marshall Plan, which provided capital, goods, and technical expertise to reconstruct economies devastated by the war. Ports, factories, railways, and roads were repaired or modernized, while agricultural production was revitalized to prevent famine and ensure social stability. Industrial growth created employment opportunities, reduced social unrest, and reinforced the political legitimacy of democratic governments. The emphasis on interdependence and cooperative recovery was both pragmatic and strategic, designed to create prosperity while simultaneously countering the appeal of communist ideologies spreading from the East. Western Europe's economic recovery, therefore, was inseparable from its political positioning within a world divided by ideology. In parallel, security and military alliances emerged as pillars of post-war order. NATO, established in 1949, formalized collective defense among Western nations, ensuring that any aggression would meet unified resistance. The Soviet Union responded by reinforcing its influence in Eastern Europe and establishing military coordination among aligned nations, eventually leading to the Warsaw Pact. These alliances institutionalized the continent's divisions, embedding ideological, military, and political fault lines that would persist throughout the Cold War. Citizens living in border regions, especially in Germany, Poland, and the Baltics, experienced these divisions in their daily lives, navigating checkpoints, surveillance, and competing claims of sovereignty. Europe's recovery was thus inseparable from vigilance, as peace depended not only on infrastructure and economy but also on careful management of emerging global tensions. Social reconstruction also became a critical focus. After years of conflict, civilians demanded justice, stability, and renewed opportunity. Nuremberg and other war crimes trials set precedents for international accountability, demonstrating that individual and state actions carried consequences. Education systems were rebuilt to foster democratic values in the West and ideological conformity in the East. Healthcare systems, devastated by years of war and deprivation, were reconstructed with an emphasis on accessibility and public welfare. Cultural revival, including the restoration of theaters, libraries, museums, and universities, offered both a sense of continuity and a symbolic reclamation of identity. Intellectuals, artists, and civic leaders became active participants in shaping public consciousness, bridging the past's trauma with the future's promise. Despite these advancements, the shadow of the war persisted. Political borders, though stabilized by treaties, remained contested in perception and memory. Ethnic tensions, fueled by forced migrations and historical grievances, simmered beneath the surface. Economic disparities between East and West created frustrations, migration pressures, and ideological conflict. Citizens confronted the dual reality of physical recovery and intangible unease, aware that Europe's fragile peace could easily be disrupted by economic hardship, political miscalculation, or renewed aggression. Rebuilding was therefore a continuous process, blending diplomacy, infrastructure, human resilience, and cultural healing in a way that had no precedent in history. By the mid-1950s, Europe had, in many ways, successfully transitioned from a landscape of total destruction to one of cautious hope. Railways and roads connected nations that had been isolated, factories produced goods that fed economies, governments asserted authority while citizens gradually reclaimed agency, and international institutions provided frameworks for dialogue and cooperation. Yet the continent remained fundamentally divided, ideologically, politically, and socially, reflecting both the successes and limitations of post-war reconstruction. The experience of 1939 to 1945 had left an indelible mark, shaping policy, governance, and public consciousness for generations. Europe's story was no longer just about rebuilding cities or economies, it was about sustaining a fragile peace while navigating a world where power, ideology, and survival were inseparable. The dawn of the Cold War thus cast a long shadow over the post-war continent. Europe had physically and institutionally recovered, yet it remained a theater of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, democracy and communism, market economies and centrally planned systems. Citizens lived with the dual realities of opportunity and tension, reconstruction and surveillance, hope and fear. The continent's recovery was both extraordinary and incomplete, visible in new skylines, railways, and factories, invisible in the complex political, social, and psychological adjustments required to maintain order. Europe had survived total war, but its survival came with a price: a delicate balance of power, a constant negotiation between past grievances and future aspirations, and the persistent need to learn from history while shaping a better tomorrow.